Hook imagines standing on a battlefield, the air heavy with dust, the ground trembling under the march of tens of thousands of soldiers. Before you stretch endless lines of men in shining armour, shields locked together, spears pointing forward like a wall of iron. These were not ordinary warriors. These were the legions of Rome. And it was their discipline, their strategies, and their military secrets that built one of the greatest empires the world has ever known. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, let us step quietly into the past and uncover the hidden ways Rome conquered and ruled the world. Chapter 1. The birth of the Legion. Long before Rome became an empire, it was nothing more than a modest town on the banks of the Tiber River. Its huts were simple, its walls thin, and its neighbours strong. To the north lived the Etruscans, masters of ceremony and builders of stone. To the east hid the Samnites, fierce mountain warriors who thrived in rough terrain. To the south, Greek colonies dotted the coast, bringing with them the wealth and wisdom of the Mediterranean. And across the rivers to the west, the wild and unpredictable Gauls gathered in restless tribes. Rome was small, weak, and seemingly insignificant. Survival itself was a daily struggle. But out of this struggle came something remarkable. A system of war unlike any seen before. The Romans, unlike many peoples of their age, were not too proud to learn from their enemies. They borrowed what worked, discarded what failed, and always improved. In their earliest days, they fought like the Greeks, standing in tight phalanxes, rows of men shoulder to shoulder, spears bristling, shields locked together. On open ground, the phalanx was powerful, a moving wall of bronze and iron. But Italy was not like Greece. Its hills and forests broke the phalanx apart, turning its strength into weakness. The Romans realized this, and so they changed. They created the manipular legion. Instead of one heavy wall of men, the army was divided into smaller units called maniples, each about 120 soldiers. These maniples were arranged like a checkerboard, leaving gaps that allowed them to move and flow around obstacles. Imagine standing on a hill, looking down at the Roman lines. Instead of a solid block, you would see small squares advancing, retreating, shifting, and filling spaces. Where the ground was rough, they could adjust. Where the enemy was strong, they could surround and strike from the sides. This flexibility made the legion far more deadly than the rigid phalanx. Training was the lifeblood of the legion. A recruit did not simply pick up a sword and march to war. He trained every day, carrying heavy packs of tools and supplies, often weighing more than 30 kilograms. He marched for miles under the sun, learning to keep pace with his comrades, step after step, without breaking formation. When evening came, there was no rest until the camp was built. The Romans never slept in disorder. They dug trenches, raised walls of earth, hammered wooden stakes into the ground, and built fortified camps each night. Within hours, a safe city of tents and walls rose from the earth. Even in hostile lands, the legion rested behind defences. Other armies might lie down under the stars, careless and exposed, but a Roman soldier could close his eyes knowing that his comrades had guarded the camp with sweat and labour. The layout of the camp itself was a secret to Rome's power. Every camp followed the same design. 4 gates, straight streets, a central square, and clearly marked areas for each unit. A soldier who had marched across half of Italy could walk into a new camp and immediately know where he belonged. This order created comfort and security. Even far from home, the camp felt familiar. It was discipline carved into the earth itself. Weapons too carried Rome's genius. The gladius, a short double-edged sword, looked simple, but in close combat it was unmatched. Instead of wide swings, soldiers stabbed quickly, slipping the blade between armour and shields. A few inches of steel, driven again and again, was deadlier than a grand slash. Alongside it came the pilum, the Roman javelin. Heavy, with a long iron tip, it was designed to bend on impact. When thrown, it pierced enemy shields and stuck fast, dragging the shield down with its weight. The enemy had no choice but to throw the shield away, leaving himself unprotected. And then there was the scutum, the great Roman shield. Tall, curved, and rectangular, it covered most of a man's body. Locked together, dozens of scuta formed a solid wall. Raised above, they became a roof. This was the famous Testudo, the tortoise. Arrows and stones bounced harmlessly from its shell as the legion marched forward, step by step. To face such a formation was to fight against a living fortress. But weapons alone did not win battles. The real secret was discipline. A Roman soldier was not just a warrior, but a cog in a great machine. He obeyed his officers without hesitation. Orders came through signals, horns, drums, flags, and the voices of centurions. Centurions, chosen from the bravest veterans, commanded about 80 men each. They carried vine staffs, symbols of their authority, and did not hesitate to strike a soldier who disobeyed. To rise to the rank of centurion was an honour earned through blood and courage, not birth or wealth. This gave ordinary men hope. Loyalty and bravery could raise them high. Punishments were harsh. A coward might be whipped, a deserter executed. In the darkest moments, entire units could face decimation, 1 in 10 chosen by lot and beaten to death by his comrades. It was a terrible practice, but it carved fear into the hearts of men. No one wanted to be the reason his brothers suffered, yet alongside punishment came reward. Soldiers who fought bravely could receive crowns, golden armlets, or even land. Some were granted citizenship for themselves and their families. Rome's stick was hard, but its carrot was sweet. Carrot was sweet. Together they forged a loyalty stronger than iron. The daily life of a soldier was as much about work as about war. When not marching or fighting, he repaired roads, built bridges, dug ditches, and cut wood. He learned to cook rations of grain into porridge, to mend his sandals, to sharpen his blade. Every man carried his own kit, not just weapons but tools. In this way, each soldier was self-reliant, yet always part of the greater machine. Imagine the sound of such a camp at night. The clang of hammers as stakes were driven into the ground, the scrape of shovels as ditches were dug. The quiet murmur of men sharpening swords under torchlight. And then, as darkness deepened, silence. Guards stood at their posts, shields at their sides, spears ready, while the rest of the army slept within safe walls. It was this rhythm, march, build, fight, rest, that allowed Rome to fight year after year without breaking. Even their enemies noticed. Greek mercenaries, once proud of their phalanxes, admitted that the Romans fought with an endurance unlike any other. The Samnites, skilled in mountain fighting, struggled to break the manipular system. And across the sea, the leaders of Carthage began to whisper with unease, for they sensed that this small city on the Tiber was no longer a mere neighbour. It was a rising power, armed with discipline, unity, and secrets of war that no one else could match. The birth of the legion was not sudden. It was shaped by defeat, polished by necessity, and hardened by struggle. Where others clung to tradition, Rome embraced change. Where others fought as warriors, Rome fought as an army. Each man a part of the whole, each legion a living machine. And this machine was only beginning. Soon it would be tested in wars that would shake the Mediterranean, against enemies stronger, richer, and older than Rome itself. But time and again, the legions would prove that their discipline, their adaptability, and their secrets were enough to turn the tide of history. Chapter 2. Wars that built Rome. The young Republic of Rome, with its newly forged legions, did not rise in peace. Its strength was tested again and again in the fires of war, and each conflict carved new lessons into the Roman way of fighting. These were the wars that built Rome, shaping its legions into the unstoppable force that would one day command the Mediterranean. The first of these trials came against the Samnites, fierce mountain warriors who lived in the rugged lands of central Italy. The Samnites were not strangers to war. They were skilled at ambushes, at sudden strikes from rocky passes and narrow valleys. They knew how to use their land to their advantage, darting from behind boulders, hurling javelins, then vanishing into the hills. The Romans, used to fighting on open fields, struggled in this unforgiving terrain. There is a story, told again and again, of the Caudine Forks. The year was 321 BCE. A Roman army marched through a narrow mountain pass, unaware that the Samnites had blocked both ends. When the Romans realized they were trapped, it was too late. Surrounded and humiliated, they were forced to surrender without a fight. The Samnites demanded that the entire army pass under a yoke of spears, a symbol of total submission. Imagine thousands of Roman soldiers, proud men of the Republic, forced to stoop and shuffle beneath wooden beams as their enemies mocked them. It was one of Rome's darkest shames, but here lay the secret of Rome. They did not let defeat destroy them. Instead, they learned. They studied the tactics of the Samnites, the way they moved, the way they struck and vanished. And then the Romans adapted. They trained their soldiers to fight in rough terrain, to split into smaller units, to use flexibility instead of brute force. Slowly, painfully, Rome turned its humiliation into strength. By the end of the Samnite Wars, it was the Romans who stood victorious. Their manipular legions hardened and improved, yet the Samnites were only the beginning. A greater challenge soon arrived from across the sea. King Pyrrhus of Epirus, a Greek adventurer and brilliant commander. Pyrrhus brought with him something the Romans had never faced before: war elephants. These towering beasts, clad in armour, trumpeting with fury, were like monsters from another world. At the Battle of Heraclea in 280 BCE, Roman soldiers watched in horror as the elephants charged. Horses panicked, lines broke, men were crushed beneath massive feet. The Romans were defeated. But again they learned. At the next battle, they prepared fire and missiles to frighten the beasts. They taught their soldiers not to panic, to stab at the elephants' legs, to target the mahouts who rode them. Pyrrhus won battles, but at terrible cost. So many of his men died that he is remembered today for the phrase a Pyrrhic victory, a victory so costly that it feels like defeat. Rome, battered but unbroken, endured where Pyrrhus could not. Eventually he sailed back to Greece, leaving Italy in Roman hands. And then came the greatest test of all, Carthage. Carthage was not a city like Rome. It was a mighty trading empire, rich from the treasures of the Mediterranean. Its fleets ruled the seas. Its merchants filled markets from Spain to Africa. Its generals commanded armies of mercenaries drawn from every corner of the world. To Carthage, Rome was just a rising power, dangerous but not yet equal. To Rome, Carthage was an obstacle standing in the way of domination. The wars between Rome and Carthage would rage for more than a century, known as the Punic Wars, and within them, one name shines above all: Hannibal Barca. Hannibal was a master of strategy, one of the greatest commanders in history. He led his army, complete with elephants, across the Alps, through snow and ice into Italy itself. No one believed it possible, but he did it. When the Romans first met Hannibal at the Battle of Trebia, they were shocked by his cunning. He lured them into icy rivers, ambushed them with hidden troops and cut them down. Thousands of Romans died. At Lake Trasimene, he trapped an entire army against the water and slaughtered them almost to the last man. And at Cannae, in 216 BCE, Hannibal achieved perhaps the most famous victory of all. The Romans outnumbered him 2-1. Confident in their size, they attacked. Hannibal allowed his centre to bend and retreat, drawing the Romans in. Then his cavalry struck from the sides, his infantry closed from behind, and the Roman army was surrounded in a deadly circle. It was a massacre. Some 50,000 Romans fell in a single day. The fields were carpeted with bodies, the Tiber ran red with blood. It was one of the worst defeats in Roman history. Any other nation would have collapsed, but Rome did not. Here again lay the Roman secret. Even when shattered, even when their armies lay broken, they refused to surrender. They raised new legions. They changed their tactics, refusing to fight Hannibal in open battle. Instead, they shadowed him, harassed his supply lines, and slowly bled his army dry. They took the war to Spain, to Sicily, to Africa, stretching Carthage thin. Finally, at the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, the Romans faced Hannibal one last time. This time, they were ready for his elephants, opening their lines to let the beasts pass harmlessly through. Hannibal fought bravely, but Rome prevailed. With Carthage defeated, Rome emerged as the master of the Western Mediterranean. The legions had faced humiliation, elephants, brilliant generals, and overwhelming defeats, and yet they endured. Each loss became a lesson, each scar a reminder. By the end of these wars, the Roman military machine was sharper, stronger, and more disciplined than ever before. These early wars were the forge in which Rome's military secrets were hammered into shape. Against the Samnites, they learned flexibility. Against Pyrrhus, they learned courage in the face of the unknown. Against Hannibal, they learned endurance, the refusal to give in even when all seemed lost. Step by step, defeat by defeat, victory by victory, Rome was transformed from a small Italian city into a rising empire. The rise of Rome was not a peaceful journey. Every step forward came through the clash of swords, the clash of wills, and the bitter lessons of defeat. The legions, those disciplined bodies of men who marched beneath the Roman eagle, were shaped not in quiet drills, but in the smoke and fire of war. Their enemies were fierce, cunning, and determined, and yet one by one, those enemies would fall. Not because Rome never stumbled, but because Rome never stayed down. These were the wars that built an empire. It began with the Samnites, a proud people of the rugged mountains in central Italy. They were not rich, nor were they vast in number, but they had something the Romans had yet to master: the art of mountain warfare. Their land was all cliffs, valleys, and twisting passes, places where ambush was easier than open battle. A Roman legion, trained for orderly fighting in open fields, often found itself clumsy and exposed among the rocks. The Samnites would vanish into the high ground, then rain down javelins from above. They darted from cover to cover, striking suddenly, then retreating into terrain too harsh for the Romans to pursue. For men trained to fight shoulder to shoulder, shield against shield, this was maddening. Rome was forced to learn quickly, to adapt its formations, to break down its rigid lines into smaller, more flexible groups. But adaptation came only after humiliation, and none was greater than the disaster at the Caudine Forks in 321 BCE. The story became legend in Roman memory. A Roman army marched confidently into a narrow mountain pass, only to find the exits blocked. The Samnites had outmaneuvered them completely. There was no way forward, no way back. Surrounded, out of supplies, the mighty Roman legions could do nothing but surrender. The Samnites, knowing the weight of this victory, demanded not just the Romans' weapons, but their pride. Every Roman soldier, from the proud general to the lowest recruit, was forced to pass beneath a yoke made of enemy spears, a ritual of shame, a symbol that they were broken. Imagine the silence of thousands of men, their armour clinking softly, their heads bowed as mocking Samnite eyes watched. The humiliation seared into their memory. Rome had never suffered such disgrace, but Rome had something the Samnites did not: an iron will. They returned home in silence, broken but not destroyed. And then slowly they rebuilt. They trained harder. They studied the tactics of their enemies. They learned to fight in rough terrain, to spread out when needed, to trust not only in rigid formation, but in the skill of each soldier. Years later, when Rome returned to fight the Samnites again, the story was different. The Manipular Legion, divided into flexible units that could shift and maneuver across the battlefield, was born from this bitter defeat. What had once been shame became the foundation of Roman strength. But if the Samnites taught Rome flexibility, another enemy soon arrived to teach them fear. His name was Pyrrhus of Epirus, a Greek king, a cousin of Alexander the Great, and a man born for war. Pyrrhus crossed the sea with a gleaming army of trained phalanxes, veterans who fought in the Macedonian style with long spears bristling like the quills of a hedgehog. But Pyrrhus brought something even more terrifying: creatures the Romans had never seen before: elephants of war. At the Battle of Heraclea in 280 BCE, the Romans stood proudly against this foreign king. The clash of steel rang across the field as the legions pressed against the Greek phalanx. The Romans fought bravely, pushing with shield and sword, their discipline tested against the spear wall. But then, with a thunder like rolling storms, Pyrrhus released his elephants. Huge beasts, armoured in bronze, trumpeting with wild fury, stormed forward. Horses panicked at the sight, bolting and throwing their riders. Men screamed as tusks swept them aside like twigs. Some soldiers froze, others broke ranks and fled. The mighty Roman line buckled. That day, Rome was beaten. And yet, even in defeat, they observed. They studied the way the elephants moved, the way they panicked when fire was near, the way they faltered when their drivers were struck. When they next faced Pyrrhus, they came prepared with firebrands, with sharper javelins aimed at the mahouts, with tighter discipline. Pyrrhus still won battles, but at such cost to his own men that each victory weakened him. From these costly triumphs comes the phrase still used today: a Pyrrhic victory, a win that feels like defeat. Pyrrhus left Italy in the end, exhausted, and Rome remained standing. Rome had beaten the mountain warriors of Italy. They had withstood the elephants of Greece. But the greatest challenge was yet to come. Across the sea, on the northern coast of Africa, stood a city of wealth and power: Carthage. Carthage was older than Rome, richer, its harbours filled with ships, its markets bursting with goods from Spain, Gaul and beyond. If Rome was rising, Carthage already stood tall. The two powers collided in what history calls the Punic Wars, and for over a century the struggle between them would decide the fate of the Mediterranean. And from Carthage arose a man whose name would haunt Roman memory for generations: Hannibal Barca. Hannibal was not merely a general. He was a genius of war, cunning, fearless and relentless. Sworn by his father to hate Rome, he dedicated his life to its destruction. Pert's destruction. And in 218 BCE, he made his boldest move. Leading an army of soldiers, cavalry, and yes, elephants, Hannibal marched not across the sea, but across the towering Alps. Snowstorms lashed his men, cliffs swallowed horses, avalanches crushed columns of troops. The journey claimed half his army. But when Hannibal descended into Italy, he emerged with a corps of hardened veterans and beasts that Roman eyes had never expected to see in their homeland. At the Battle of Trebia, Hannibal's brilliance shone. He lured the Romans into icy rivers, weakening them before springing ambushes. At Lake Trasimene, he trapped an entire Roman army between the lake and the hills, slaughtering them almost to the last man. And then came Cannae, the darkest day in Roman military history. The Romans gathered perhaps 80,000 men, confident their numbers would crush Hannibal's smaller force. The battle began, and Hannibal's centre slowly retreated. The Romans pushed harder, believing victory was near. But this was Hannibal's trap. As the Roman mass surged forward, his cavalry smashed their flanks, his hidden troops closed from behind, and suddenly the vast Roman army was encircled in a deadly ring. There was no escape. Hour after hour, the slaughter continued. By the end of the day, as many as 50,000 Romans lay dead. It was a nightmare beyond imagining, a wound that scarred Rome forever. And yet, Rome did not surrender. This is the secret of their empire. Where others would crumble, Rome endured. After Cannae, they raised new armies. They refused to meet Hannibal in open battle again, shadowing him, starving him, bleeding him slowly. While Hannibal rampaged through Italy, Rome struck at Carthage's holdings abroad, in Spain, in Sicily, in Africa itself. Slowly the tide turned. In 202 BCE, at the Battle of Zama, the Romans faced Hannibal for the last time. This time, they had studied him. This time, they were ready. They were ready. When his elephants charged, the Romans opened their lines, letting the beasts pass harmlessly through. Their cavalry, now stronger than before, drove off his horsemen. Their legions pressed relentlessly forward. Hannibal fought with all his genius, but Rome had learned too well. The battle was lost, and with it, Carthage's power was broken. Rome emerged from the Punic Wars transformed. They had faced ambush in the mountains, monsters of flesh and tusk, generals of unmatched brilliance. They had known humiliation, fear, and near destruction, but each trial became a lesson. From the Samnites they gained flexibility. From Pyrrhus they learned courage in the face of the unknown. From Hannibal they mastered endurance, the ability to lose, to bleed, to suffer, and still rise again. By the end of these wars, Rome was no longer just a city in Italy. It was the master of the Western Mediterranean. Its legions were sharper than steel, forged in the fire of endless battles. The eagle standards marched farther than ever before, and the dream of empire was no longer just a dream. The wars had built Rome. And Rome in turn was now ready to build the world. The strength of Rome was not only in its soldiers' discipline, nor only in the steel of their swords. What truly set Rome apart, what turned defeats into victories and victories and victories into empire, were the secrets of its strategy. For Rome understood war not as a single battle, but as a struggle of years, of endurance, of planning. Other nations fought for glory, for gold, for a quick triumph. Rome fought to win and to keep winning, no matter how long it took. Picture, if you will, a Roman council at war. The generals sit in their tents, maps spread across wooden tables. Oil lamps flicker, casting shadows across their stern faces. Outside, soldiers sharpen swords, tend to fires, or mend armor. But inside, decisions are made that will shape the fate of nations. So, Rome's genius was not always on the battlefield itself, but in how it prepared for the battlefield, in the patient weaving of supply lines, alliances, and traps. The first secret was logistics, the art of feeding an army. A Roman legion on campaign was not a wild mob of warriors living off plunder. It was a machine, carefully supplied by wagons, depots, and roads. Wherever the legions went, they built roads of stone, bridges across rivers, fortified camps at every night's halt. The soldiers carried tools as well as weapons. In a single day, an entire army could cut ditches, raise palisades, and create a fortress from bare earth. These camps were not just places to sleep. They were strongholds, safe against sudden attack, organized with streets, granaries, hospitals, and command tents. Even at rest, the Romans were ready for war. This discipline allowed them to fight far from home. Other armies grew weaker the farther they marched. Rome grew stronger. its supply lines stretching behind like veins carrying lifeblood. And wherever a Roman road was built, Rome itself reached farther, binding new lands into its grasp. Even centuries later, those roads would still run straight and true, the skeleton of empire. The second secret lay in adaptability. The Roman legion was not bound to one rigid style of fighting. They studied their enemies, borrowed their strengths, and made them their own. From the Etruscans they took the heavy armour of iron. From the Greeks the use of siege engines and naval tactics. From the Samnites the manipular formation. Rome's army was like a sponge, absorbing the knowledge of every foe it faced. Consider how the Romans dealt with the elephants of Pyrrhus or the cunning of Hannibal. At first they stumbled, they bled. But they learned. Against Hannibal, they discovered the value of delay, refusing to be drawn into battle, harassing his supply lines instead. Against Macedonian phalanxes, they learned to exploit gaps in the long spear lines, cutting down soldiers who could not turn quickly in tight terrain. Against Eastern horse archers, centuries later, they would create layered defences of shields and javelins, denying swift riders their prey. No matter the enemy, Rome would watch, adapt, and respond. The third secret was persistence. Rome's enemies often fought for a single battle. If they lost, their courage wavered, their alliances shattered. Rome was different, even in the face of disaster. Like at Cannae, the Republic simply raised new armies, recruited more men, trained fresh legions. There seemed to be no end to Roman resolve. Where others would negotiate peace, Rome tightened its grip. To Romans, war was not over until Rome said it was over. This persistence terrified their enemies. When Pyrrhus won yet another costly victory, he is said to have looked upon his weary army and muttered, "If I win one more battle like this, I am lost." He understood what Rome's enemies always learned too late. Rome could lose again and again, but it would always return stronger than before. The fourth secret was organisation. The legion was not simply a mass of men, but a carefully structured body. 10 cohorts, each divided into centuries, each century commanded by centurions who knew every man under them. Orders flowed smoothly, discipline was enforced, and even in chaos, the legion moved as one. Where other armies might dissolve into panic if their leader fell, Roman units could continue the fight. Every soldier knew his place, his duty, his role in the greater whole. And finally, the greatest secret of all, the Roman mindset. To Romans, war was not merely survival, it was destiny. Each victory was a step toward their belief that Rome was chosen to rule. The Senate's decrees, the prayers to Jupiter and Mars, the weight of tradition, all these fed into a sense of purpose that turned soldiers into instruments of fate. A Roman legionary did not march only for pay or plunder. He marched because he believed Rome must conquer, that the gods themselves demanded it. This conviction made him unbreakable. Think of a Roman army in the field. At dawn, horns blare. Soldiers rise from their ordered rows of tents. They ate their rations of bread and porridge. Centurions bark orders. Armour is polished, weapons checked. Standards are raised, the eagle gleaming in the morning light. The soldiers form lines, shields locking, spears ready. Behind them stretch the roads, the supply wagons, the endless pulse of the Republic. Before them lies the enemy, fierce, proud, confident. And yet, the Romans advance with calm steadiness. They know that even if they lose today, Rome will endure. That certainty is more powerful than any weapon. And so, the secrets of Roman strategy were not tricks or sudden strokes of genius. They were habits, disciplines, ways of thinking that turned Rome into something more than just another city-state. Logistics gave them reach. Adaptability gave them resilience. Persistence gave them inevitability. Organisation gave them strength. And belief gave them purpose. It was this blend, this careful mixture, that made the Roman legions more than an army. They were the embodiment of Rome itself, patient, disciplined, relentless. Other nations had their heroes, their moments of glory, their sudden victories, but Rome's secret was different. Rome's secret was that it never stopped moving forward. These strategies, tested and proven, became the foundation of an empire that would stretch across 3 continents. And as we drift deeper into this story, you may begin to feel what Rome's enemies felt. The steady pressure of a force that could not be broken, a shadow spreading wider and wider, until resistance seemed impossible. Rome did not win because it was the strongest in every battle. Rome won because it refused to ever truly lose. The clash of swords, the thunder of marching feet, the roar of battle, these are the sounds we imagine when we think of Roman soldiers. But most of the time, life in the legions was not spent on blood-soaked fields. It was spent in the long, endless rhythm of routine. For every battle there were weeks, even months, of marching, drilling, building, waiting. To understand the true power of the Roman army, you must step into the quieter moments, into the daily life of a Roman soldier. Imagine dawn in a Roman camp. Oof-boo! The first light spills over the horizon, painting the sky with pale colours. A horn sounds sharp and clear, waking thousands of men at once. From their orderly rows of tents, soldiers stir. These tents, made of heavy leather, house 8 men to a contubernium, a squad that lived, ate, and fought together. For a Roman soldier, the men who shared his tent were more than comrades. They were brothers, bound not just by duty, but by the daily grind of survival. The morning begins with the simplest of tasks: packing away bedding, strapping on armour, preparing rations. Breakfast is meagre, usually a portion of hard bread, sometimes a bit of cheese, perhaps a taste of wine diluted with water. It is not a meal for comfort, but for fuel. The legion is a machine, and every man must be ready to move. Soon after, the soldiers form up for inspection. Centurions walk the lines, their vine staffs in hand. A glance at a dull sword, a poorly fastened strap, or a lazy stance could bring swift punishment. Discipline was not optional in Rome. It was the heartbeat of the army. The Romans believed that an undisciplined soldier was more dangerous than the enemy himself. And so every morning armour was checked, shields were tested, and order was enforced. Then came the drills. Again came the drills. Day after day, soldiers trained as if every moment could be their last. They marched in formation, shields interlocked, learning to move as a single living body. They practiced thrusting with the short gladius, always at the heart or throat, never wasting motion. They hurled pila, the heavy javelins designed to bend on impact so they could not be thrown back. They sparred with wooden swords twice as heavy as the real ones, so that in battle their arms would feel light, swift, and deadly. But the Roman soldier was not only a warrior, he was also a builder. Wherever the legion went, the landscape changed. By midday, picks and shovels were in hand. Soldiers cut roads straight through hills and marshes, raised bridges across rivers, and dug defensive ditches. Each night, no matter how exhausted, the men built a fortified camp. Ditches were dug, palisades were raised, gates were marked. Within hours, what had been an open field became a fortress. This was one of Rome's greatest secrets. Its soldiers were engineers as well as fighters. As the sun climbed higher, work slowed, and men returned to their tents for the midday meal. Grain was the staple of life. Each soldier carried a ration of wheat, which he ground by hand into flour, then baked into flat bread over small fires. Meat was rare, but beans, cheese, and dried fruits sometimes filled the gaps. Wine, always diluted, was shared freely. Eating was not just nourishment, it was a moment of fellowship. Around the fire, men laughed, swapped stories, and remembered home. Some carved dice from bone, gambling for trinkets. Others whittled wood into figurines, or scratched letters onto wax tablets to send back to their families. Yet even in these quiet moments, discipline lingered. A soldier could not simply wander off. The camp was a world of order, with strict divisions for officers, supply wagons and hospitals, supply wagons and hospitals. The standards of the legion stood at the heart of it all, guarded at all times, for they were more than symbols. They were the very soul of the army. To lose a standard was unthinkable, a shame worse than death. Afternoons might bring more drills, or tasks like repairing equipment, tending to animals, or sharpening weapons. Leather straps were oiled, sandals mended, armour polished until it gleamed. The clatter of hammers on iron, the hiss of sharpening stones, and the murmur of men's voices filled the camp. Nothing was wasted, everything was maintained. For a Roman soldier, neglecting equipment was like neglecting life itself, and when the sun dipped low, the camp settled once more into its rhythm. Evening brought another meal, another round of laughter and murmurs around the fire. But before sleep, the watch was set. The Roman camp was never unguarded. Soldiers drew lots for shifts, standing at their posts through the night, eyes scanning the darkness, ears straining for the sound of enemy feet. To sleep on watch was punishable by death, for if one man failed, the whole legion could perish. Punishment was woven into the fabric of Roman life. Flogging, loss of rations, or public humiliation awaited those who broke discipline. In the worst cases, there was decimation, the execution of every 10th man in a disgraced unit chosen by lot, while the survivors were forced to watch. These measures were brutal, but they forged a fear more powerful than any enemy's blade. Better to face the foe than to face the wrath of Rome. Yet it was not all harshness. There was pride too. The bond of the legion ran deep. A soldier could trust the man beside him with his life because that man had trained with him, built camps with him, marched the same endless miles. In the silence of the night, when the fires dimmed and the stars shone above, a soldier might whisper a prayer to Mars, the god of war, or to his household gods far away in Rome. He might think of his family, of the farms and streets he had left behind. But he also knew that he was part of something greater, the eternal march of Rome itself. And so the daily life of a Roman soldier was not glamorous, but it was relentless. Wake, train, build, eat, march, guard, sleep, over and over like the turning of the seasons. This rhythm, this unbreakable cycle, was what made the Roman army more than an army. It made it a force of nature. For when battle finally came, when horns sounded and standards were lifted, the soldiers were not untested men thrown into chaos. They were machines of flesh and will, sharpened by endless routine, bound by brotherhood, and driven by discipline. And when they advanced, shield against shield, step by step, it was as though all of Rome moved forward with them. This was the secret heartbeat of the empire. Not the roar of glory, but the quiet grind of daily life. The soldier's bread, the soldier's sweat, the soldier's silence in the night watch. These were the stones upon which Rome built its dominion. For without the patience of its legions, without the endless endurance of its ordinary men, the grand victories would never have come. And so, when you think of Rome's might, do not picture only the battlefield. Picture also the dawn in a Roman camp, the sound of 1,000 men rising in unison, the glow of fires against leather tents, the steady rhythm of drills and hammers and marching feet. It was in these simple, tireless routines that Rome's empire was forged, day by day, soldier by soldier, until the world itself bent to the eagle's shadow. Picture this, a battlefield stretching out beneath a pale sun, the air heavy with dust, the ground trembling with the march of thousands of soldiers. Across the plain the enemy waits, their banners fluttering, their weapons glinting. Between the two armies lies silence, the stillness before the storm, and then, slowly, the Roman legions begin to move. Not with the wild rush of barbarians, not with the desperate cries of men charging blindly, but with measured steps, shields locked, lines straight as though drawn by the hand of a god. This was the Roman way of war, a discipline, precision, and a strategy that turned ordinary men into an unstoppable machine. The Romans understood something most of their enemies never grasped. Battles are not won by courage alone. They are won by order. A single soldier might be brave, but bravery without control collapses into chaos. A legion, on the other hand, was bravery bound in iron, drilled into obedience, and sharpened into something greater than the sum of its parts. At the heart of this system was the formation. The Romans perfected the art of fighting as one body. The most famous of these was the Testudo, the tortoise formation. Imagine a wall of shields rising before you, interlocked so tightly that not even an arrow could slip through. The front ranks held their shields forward, while those behind raised theirs overhead, creating a living shell. Against this slow advancing fortress, stones and spears simply rattled harmlessly away. To face a Testudo was to face inevitability itself, a creeping wall of men that would not break. But the Romans did not rely on one formation alone. The triplex Achilles, or triple battle line, was their standard. 3 rows of soldiers stood ready, the youngest in front, eager and untested, the seasoned fighters in the second line, and the veterans, the hardened core of the legion, in the third. If the first line faltered, they would fall back, slipping through gaps in the ranks, while the second line stepped forward. If they too wavered, the veterans advanced, steady and unshakable. This system meant that a Roman legion could absorb blow after blow without breaking, like waves crashing against a cliff. And then there was the weaponry itself, designed not for show but for ruthless efficiency. The Roman gladius was a short sword, ideal for stabbing in tight formation. Unlike the long, sweeping blades of their enemies, the gladius was meant for thrusts between shield gaps, quick and deadly. The palum, their heavy javelin, was thrown at the start of battle. Its iron tip was crafted to bend on impact, piercing shields and making them useless. With their defences shattered, the enemy was forced to face the advance of the legions with nothing but panic in their hands. Yet, strategy was not just about weapons. It was about psychology. The Romans understood fear, how to wield it, how to break their enemies before the clash even began. They would march in silence, drums and horns marking their rhythm, the steady tramp of thousands of sandals echoing like thunder. To watch them approach was to see inevitability itself, not wild men rushing for glory, but an unyielding force, as calm and patient as stone. Many enemies broke before the first sword was drawn, but when the fighting began, the battlefield became a stage for Roman adaptability. They were masters of adjustment, reshaping their lines, shifting formations, and responding to threats in moments. If cavalry threatened their flanks, the legion pivoted, shields turning outward like a spinning fortress. If terrain broke their formation, cohorts, small units within the legion, fought independently, each capable of holding its ground. Unlike armies that relied on a single leader's command, Rome's structure allowed flexibility at every level, and always at the centre of it all stood the centurion. These were not generals nor noble-born officers, but hardened soldiers who led by example. Their voices carried over the clash, their vine staffs struck down on wavering men, their courage shone brightest in the darkest moments. A legion fought as one, because every man looked to his centurion, and every centurion fought as though Rome itself watched. Consider the Battle of Pydna in 168 BCE, where Rome faced the mighty phalanx of Macedon. The phalanx was a wall of spears, feared across the world, nearly impossible to break head-on. But when the uneven ground disrupted its perfect formation, the Romans seized the moment. Small groups of legionaries darted into the gaps, stabbing between the long spears with their short swords. The phalanx, once a terror, shattered like glass under Roman adaptability. It was not brute strength that won the day. It was the Roman way of war, or take the campaigns against the Gauls. Fierce warriors, the Gauls charged with wild cries, their massive swords raised high. At first their fury seemed unstoppable. But the Romans did not meet fury with fury. They raised their shields locked into formation and waited. The storm of Gauls crashed into a wall of iron, their long swords glancing uselessly off disciplined shields. Then, when the Gauls grew tired, the legions advanced step by step, thrust by thrust, until chaos gave way to order and order to victory. This was the genius of Rome. Never to fight the enemy's battle, but to force the enemy to fight Rome's. Every tactic, every formation, every weapon served one purpose: to control the chaos of war. To make the unpredictable predictable, to turn fear into a weapon and discipline into destiny. And yet, for the soldier on the field, these tactics were not abstract theories, they were life and death. Imagine standing shield to shield in the front rank, your ears filled with the clash of steel, your breath hot beneath your helmet. You cannot swing wildly, your arm must thrust in perfect rhythm, your shield must never waver. You trust the man beside you to hold his ground, just as he trusts you. If one breaks, the line collapses. If all hold, the line advances. The battlefield was not a place of individual glory, but of collective survival. A Roman soldier did not fight for himself alone. He fought for the man at his side, for his centurion's voice, for the eagle standard, glinting above the ranks. That standard was more than a piece of metal. It was the spirit of the legion. To see it fall was to feel despair. To see it raised high was to know Rome still lived. And so, the Roman way of war was not just about tactics, it was about transformation. Ordinary men, farmers and labourers became parts of a greater whole. On the battlefield, they ceased to be individuals. They became Rome itself, patient, unyielding, eternal. This was how an empire was won. Not through chance, not through luck, not through wild courage, but through the cold, relentless precision of an army that had mastered the art of control. Step by step, formation by formation, battle by battle, Rome advanced until the world bent before its disciplined march. And when the dust settled, when the enemy lay broken and the eagle's standard still gleamed in the sun, the world knew a simple truth. To stand against Rome was to stand against inevitability itself. The rise of Rome was not a single explosion of power, but a slow, grinding machine, relentless, patient, and unstoppable. From a small city on the banks of the Tiber River, Rome grew outward like ripples in water, swallowing first her neighbours, then whole kingdoms, and finally, entire civilizations. The story of this expansion is not just about armies marching and battles won. It is about how Rome built a conquest machine, a system so powerful, so adaptable, that it turned every victory into a stepping stone for the next. Close your eyes and imagine yourself in Italy, Around the year 500 BCE, Rome is not yet the empire of marble forums and grand legions. It is still a struggling city-state, one of many among the Latin tribes. At this time, Italy is a patchwork of peoples, the Etruscans in the north, the Samnites in the mountains, the Greeks in the south. Each has their strength: the artistry of the Etruscans, the ferocity of the Samnites, the wealth and culture of the Greeks. Rome is not the strongest among them, not the wealthiest, not even the oldest, and yet, quietly, methodically, it begins to rise. The first step in Rome's expansion was not conquest by brute force, but conquest by alliance. Rome fought wars, yes, but just as often it made treaties. When it defeated a rival, it did not always destroy them. Instead, it offered a deal: loyalty in exchange for protection, tribute in exchange for peace. Sometimes this meant granting partial Roman citizenship, a clever trick. These allies could not vote in Rome, but they could share in its protection, its trade, and its growing prestige. Little by little, Rome wove a web of loyalty across Italy, and once that web was spun, no enemy could tear it apart. But Rome was not always so careful. There were brutal wars too. The Samnite Wars, lasting nearly 50 years, tested Rome's strength to the core. The Samnites were fierce warriors of the mountains, masters of ambush and rough terrain. In the early years, Rome stumbled badly, suffering humiliating defeats. The most famous came at the Caudine Forks, where an entire Roman army was trapped in a mountain pass and forced to surrender. The Samnites made them pass under a yoke of spears, a symbol of utter disgrace. For most nations, such humiliation would have shattered their spirit, but not Rome. Rome remembered, Rome endured, and Rome returned. In time, the Samnites were crushed, their lands absorbed, their warriors forced to fight for the very people they once despised. This was the Roman way: learn from defeat, adapt, and return stronger. And so, by the early 3rd century BCE, Rome had united Italy under her command. But Italy was not enough. Beyond lay the Mediterranean world, rich, powerful, dangerous. It was here that Rome faced her greatest rival, Carthage. Carthage was no small city-state. It was a maritime empire, wealthy from trade, ruling over vast stretches of North Africa, Spain, and the islands of the sea. Its warships controlled the waves, its merchants filled the markets, its generals led mercenary armies across 3 continents. For a time, it seemed that Carthage and Rome might share the world, each ruling in its own sphere. But 2 empires cannot share the same sky for long, and so began the wars that would decide the fate of the Mediterranean. The Punic Wars. The First Punic War was fought over Sicily, the jewel of the central Mediterranean. Carthage had fleets, Rome had none. But Rome, as always, learned. They built ships, copied from Carthaginian designs, and trained men who had never sailed before. To counter Carthage's naval mastery, they invented the corvus, a boarding bridge with a great iron spike. Instead of fighting ship against ship, Rome turned sea battles into land battles, where her soldiers excelled. The result? Rome, a land power, humbled the greatest naval empire of the age. Sicily became her first overseas province, the first piece of a growing empire beyond Italy. But Carthage was not finished. Out of Spain rose a man whose name would echo for centuries: Hannibal Barca. With boldness unmatched, Hannibal marched an army, complete with war elephants, across the Alps into Italy itself. For over a decade he ravaged the Roman heartland, winning battle after battle. At Cannae, his genius reached its peak. Surrounded on all sides, a Roman army of 80,000 men was slaughtered almost to the last. It was one of the greatest defeats Rome ever suffered, a wound so deep that other nations might never have recovered. But Rome did not collapse. Cities under her command, even in the face of Hannibal's victories, did not abandon her. This loyalty was no accident. It was the web Rome had carefully spun over centuries. While Hannibal marched, Rome raised new armies again and again, refusing to yield. And at last, Rome turned the war outward. A young general named Scipio Africanus carried the fight into Spain, then into Africa itself. At the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, Scipio defeated Hannibal, breaking Carthage's power forever. Rome was now master of the Western Mediterranean. Yet even this was not enough. Carthage lingered, though weak, and Rome could not tolerate a rival. In the Third Punic War, Carthage was besieged and utterly destroyed, its walls torn down, its people sold into slavery, its land cursed, or so the stories say. Whether the Romans truly salted the earth is doubtful, but the destruction was real. Carthage was no more, and Rome stood unrivaled in the west. But the Roman machine did not stop there. It turned east toward the wealthy kingdoms of Greece and Asia. Here, Rome faced not wild tribes or mercenary armies, but ancient civilizations, heirs of Alexander the Great, steeped in culture and wealth. Yet one by one, they too fell. At Cynoscephaly and Pydna, Roman flexibility broke the rigid phalanxes of Macedon. City after city, kingdom after kingdom, was drawn into Rome's orbit. Some were conquered outright, others turned into allies, but in the end all bowed to the Roman eagle. By the 1st century BCE, Rome's machine of conquest stretched from Spain to Greece, from Africa to Asia Minor. It was not always smooth. Rebellions flared, rivals rose, civil wars broke out. Yet the machine endured, because it was not just about armies. It was about systems. Every new territory was bound into Rome's structure, taxed, garrisoned, governed. Roads tied provinces to the heart of Italy, trade flowed back to the city, and Roman law bound it all together. This was the true secret of the Roman conquest machine, not just the winning of battles, but the keeping of what was won. Many empires before had risen and fallen, conquering quickly, but collapsing just as fast. Rome was different. Rome absorbed. Rome transformed enemies into allies, allies into citizens, and citizens into Romans. Step by step, the conquered became the conquerors until there was no difference at all. And so, as the centuries turned, the map of the known world changed. Where once stood dozens of kingdoms, tribes, and empires, there now stood one vast dominion stretching farther than any before. The Mediterranean had become a Roman lake, its shores bound together by legions, roads, and law. It is easy to think of this as inevitable, as though Rome was destined to rule. But destiny is only seen in hindsight. In truth, Rome's rise was built on choices: the discipline to endure defeat, the cleverness to adapt, the ruthlessness to destroy, and above all, the patience to build not just victories, but permanence. The Roman conquest machine was not fast, it was not merciful, but it was relentless. Like the steady march of soldiers across a field, it advanced step by step, never halting, never breaking, until the world itself fell beneath its tread. And so, from a small city on the Tiber, Rome became an empire, not by chance, not by luck, but by the grinding force of a machine built of men, of discipline, of vision, an empire that for centuries would seem eternal. War is the shadow that follows every empire. For Rome, the march to greatness was written in blood. In the clash of swords, the roar of armies, and the silence of fields strewn with the fallen. Yet the true measure of Rome lies not only in the victories it won, but in the defeats it endured, the disasters that nearly broke it, and the resilience that carried it forward. To understand Rome's heart, you must walk with her through her greatest battles and her bloodiest defeats. Close your eyes and picture the rolling hills of early Italy. Here, long before Rome became a master of the Mediterranean, she faced the Samnites, fierce warriors of the mountains. The wars against them were brutal, dragging on for decades. And in this crucible of conflict came one of Rome's earliest humiliations. The Battle of the Caudine Forks in 321 BCE. Trapped in a narrow mountain pass, the Roman legions found themselves surrounded. No way forward, no way back. The Samnites offered no massacre, no river of blood. Instead, they demanded humiliation. The Romans were forced to pass beneath a yoke of spears, stripped of weapons and dignity. For any soldier, this was a wound worse than death. For Rome, it was a scar that burned for generations. And yet, as always, Rome endured. The humiliation festered, turning into iron resolve. Years later, the Samnites were crushed, their lands absorbed into Rome's growing dominion. But humiliation would come again, greater and bloodier. Travel with me now to 216 BCE, to the dusty fields of Cannae. Here, Rome faced Hannibal, the Carthaginian general whose genius would haunt them for years. Hannibal's army was smaller, but his strategy was bold. He placed his weakest troops in the centre, luring the Romans forward while his strong cavalry swept around the flanks. As the Romans pressed in, hungry for a breakthrough, the trap snapped shut. Surrounded on all sides, 80,000 Romans were cut down in a single day. Blood flowed like rivers. The ground was so thick with bodies that survivors said you could walk across the field without ever touching the earth. Cannae was more than a defeat, it was annihilation. Entire generations of Rome's elite fell in a single battle. Many allies wavered, some cities defected, and for a moment the world wondered if Rome would fall. But Rome did not break. With grim determination, they refused to negotiate, refused to yield. New armies were raised, new commanders sent forth, until at last, years later, Hannibal was driven back across the sea. Yet victory, too, was Rome's legacy. Consider the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, where Scipio Africanus met Hannibal at last on African soil. Elephants thundered toward the Roman lines, their trumpeting shaking the ground. But the Romans had learned. They opened corridors in their ranks, letting the beasts pass harmlessly through, then closed again like a vice. When Hannibal's veterans met Rome's legions, the struggle was fierce, but at last the Roman discipline prevailed. Carthage fell, and Rome rose supreme in the West. Supreme in the West. But war is not always kind, even to victors. March now to the German forests of 9 CE, where the legions marched beneath the canopy of Teutoburg. Led by Publius Quinctilius Varus, 3 Roman legions were ambushed by Germanic tribes united under Arminius, a man Rome had once called an ally. The storm of the forest swallowed the legions whole. Rain poured, mud sucked at their sandals, arrows rained from the trees. For 3 days the slaughter continued, until the legions were gone. 20,000 men lost, their standards captured. When news reached Rome, Emperor Augustus wandered his palace in despair, crying, "Avarice, give me back my legions!" Never again would Rome push so deeply into the German wilds. And yet, Rome learned even here. Later, emperors struck back, punishing the tribes, reclaiming their pride, if not their lost territory. Defeat was never the end for Rome. It was a lesson, carved in blood, that shaped the empire's future. Now turn your eyes to the east, to the dusty plains of Caria in 53 BCE. Here, Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of Rome's richest men, sought glory against the Parthians. He underestimated them. The Parthian cavalry, swift and deadly, rained arrows from afar, their horse archers circling endlessly. The Romans, heavy and slow, could not catch them. Hour after hour, their lines withered beneath a storm of arrows, their peeler useless, their shields splintered. In desperation, they formed a hollow square, but it became a prison. Thirst, fear, and endless volleys broke them. Crassus was slain, his head taken as a trophy. It was one of Rome's worst disasters, a reminder that her legions, mighty as they were not invincible. Yet, Rome's victories shone just as bright. At Alesia in 52 BCE, Julius Caesar faced the Gallic leader Vercingetorix. Surrounded by tens of thousands of Gauls, Caesar built not 1 but 2 massive walls, one to contain the enemy, one to hold off reinforcements. Day after day, the Gauls hurled themselves against the fortifications, while Caesar's men held with grim determination. When at last the reinforcements broke and fled, Vercingetorix surrendered. Gaul was lost, and Rome had gained a new province, rich in land and tribute, and land and tribute. And yet, no matter how many victories Rome claimed, blood was always the price. At Pharsalus, Roman fought Roman, as Caesar and Pompey clashed in a civil war that would decide the fate of the Republic. Tens of thousands fell, not to foreign swords, but to their own brothers. At Philippi, Caesar's assassins met their end, their dream of a restored republic drowned in blood. And at Actium, on the waters of Greece, the last great rivals of Rome, Antony and Cleopatra, were swept aside by Octavian's fleet, clearing the path for an empire. Rome's history is not one of unbroken triumph. It is a tale of resilience. For every Caudine Forks there was a Zama. For every Cannae, a victory at the gates of Carthage. For every Teutoburg, the survival of an empire that would endure for centuries. Rome did not rise because she never fell. She rose because when she fell, she always stood again. So when you think of Rome, do not picture only marble temples and victorious generals. Picture also the fields of Cannae soaked with blood. Picture the forests of Teutoburg, echoing with the screams of the dying. Picture the hollow square at Carrhae, shrinking beneath endless arrows, for it was in these defeats as much as in her victories that Rome's strength was forged. An empire is not measured by the battles it wins, but by the battles it wins, but by the battles it survived. And Rome, scarred, bloodied, humbled, survived more than any empire before or since. When most people think of Rome, they picture legions marching in shining armour, emperors draped in purple, or gladiators locked in deadly combat. Yet Rome's true strength, the hidden engine of her empire, was not only in her soldiers or her rulers, but in her ability to build. Roads, aqueducts, bridges, fortresses, amphitheatres. These were not just stones stacked on stones. They were the veins and bones of an empire, binding together lands from the windswept shores of Britain to the deserts of Syria. Rome conquered with her armies, but she ruled with her engineers. Imagine standing in a Roman city 2,000 years ago. Beneath your sandals, the street is paved with great stones, so tightly fitted that centuries later they still endure. Water flows in from distant hills through towering aqueducts, feeding fountains, baths, and private homes. The air is filled with the sound of hammers on stone, carts rumbling across bridges, voices echoing in marketplaces shaded by colonnades. To live in Rome's world was to live in a world transformed by human hands. The most famous of Rome's creations were her roads. Creations were her roads. The phrase, "all roads lead to Rome," was more than a proverb. It was a reality. By the height of the empire, Rome's road network stretched over 250,000 miles, enough to circle the earth 10 times. But these were not dirt paths or crude tracks. They were marvels of engineering. Layers of gravel, sand and stone, carefully laid to withstand centuries of wear. They cut straight across mountains, swamps and plains, as though nature itself could not defy Roman will. March with the legions along the Via Appia, one of the earliest and most famous Roman roads. Built in 312 BCE, it stretched from Rome to the distant southern port of Brundisium. Soldiers could march upon it swiftly, supplies could flow without delay, and messages could reach far provinces in days instead of weeks. These roads were the empire's arteries, carrying not just armies but trade, culture, and law. Wherever a Roman road appeared, prosperity followed, and so did Roman control. But roads were only the beginning. Consider the aqueducts, those towering channels of stone that carried fresh water across valleys and plains. To the Romans, water was life, and they brought it in abundance. The Aqua Appia, the first aqueduct, was built in the same year as the Via Appia, a symbol that Rome's strength was in both war and peace. Over time, aqueducts grew in grandeur. The Aqua Claudia and Aqua Marcia spanned miles, their arches rising against the sky like monuments of stone. Some carried water over 50 miles, so perfectly engineered that the flow never faltered. With this water came public baths, fountains, and sanitation on a scale the world had never seen. A Roman city was not just a place to live, it was a place to thrive. Citizens bathed daily in vast bathhouses, filled their jars at public fountains, and walked clean streets where underground sewers carried away waste. In an age when much of the world lived in filth, Rome created islands of cleanliness, order, and health. Rome also mastered the art of building bridges and fortifications. Wooden bridges could be thrown across rivers in days, allowing legions to cross where enemies thought them trapped. Stone bridges, like the Pons Fabricius in Rome, still stand today, a testament to their durability. Along the frontiers, mighty walls rose, the most famous being Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain. Stretching across the wild landscape, it marked the very edge of the empire, a line of stone and forts meant to hold back the tribes of the north. To walk along it was to feel the presence of Rome at the edge of the known world. And then there were the amphitheatres. Though built for entertainment rather than war, they too were symbols of Roman power. The Colosseum, rising in the heart of Rome, could seat over 50,000 people, its arches soaring into the sky. Yet, even in the provinces, amphitheatres sprang up. In Gaul, in Africa, in the far corners of the empire. They were not only places of spectacle, but monuments of control, reminders that Rome brought both pleasure and dominance wherever she went. What made Roman engineering truly extraordinary was not just its scale, but its practicality. Every structure served a purpose: roads for movement, aqueducts for water, walls for defence, forums for governance. And because these works were so well built, they endured. To this day, Roman bridges carry travellers, Roman roads lie beneath highways, Roman aqueducts still deliver water in parts of Europe. Yet behind these wonders stood not emperors or patricians, but the labour of soldiers and slaves. Roman legions, when not at war, became builders. Camps, roads, forts and bridges all rose from their hands. To be a Roman soldier was to be both destroyer and creator, tearing down with the sword and raising up with the shovel. The empire's might was written not only in blood but in stone. Think for a moment of the impact on the conquered peoples. A Gallic farmer, once living in a wooden hut, now walked to market along paved streets. A Spanish villager filled his jar at a fountain fed by a distant aqueduct. A Syrian merchant sent goods by road to Rome itself, knowing they would arrive swiftly and safely. The conquered were not only ruled, they were transformed. Over time, they came to see themselves as Romans too, bound to the empire, not just by law, but by the roads beneath their feet and the water in their cups. This was the genius of Roman engineering. It was not just about building monuments to glory, but about weaving a web that held the empire together. Roads made conquest possible, aqueducts made cities flourish, walls kept enemies at bay, and amphitheatres gave the people joy. Each stone laid was another thread in a tapestry of power, one so strong that even centuries after Rome's fall, the echoes of its greatness remain. And so, when we think of Rome's empire, we must think not only of battles and emperors, but of arches against the sky, stones beneath our feet, and water flowing where once there was none. For while armies won Rome her empire, it was her engineers who kept it alive. This was the true power of Rome, not just the sword, but the stone. Not just the victories of men, but the endurance of the things they built. And long after her legions lay down their arms, long after her emperors were dust, the roads still stretched on, the aqueducts still stood, and the world still remembered the empire that built eternity out of stone. The empire of Rome was a vast machine. Its gears were soldiers, its fuel was conquest, and its roads and aqueducts were its arteries and veins. But at the very heart of that machine stood one figure, the emperor. To rule Rome was to rule the greatest power the ancient world had ever known. Yet with such power came glory beyond imagining, and madness that could consume the mind. The emperors of Rome were not simply rulers. They were symbols, gods in mortal flesh, figures who embodied both the brilliance and the darkness of an empire that stretched across the known world. Close your eyes and picture the Forum of Rome, crowded with people. The air is thick with incense, banners flutter in the wind, and the crowd waits in hushed silence. Suddenly, a man steps forward, draped in purple robes, the colour of power, a dye so rare it was reserved for emperors alone. Soldiers stand rigid in their armour, musicians sound their horns, and the people shout a single word that echoes off marble columns: Imperator. But who was this man? Was he a genius of statecraft, a hero of battle, or a tyrant drunk on power, watching the world burn as he played his fiddle? Rome gave us emperors of every kind, noble reformers, bloodthirsty conquerors, paranoid schemers, and madmen whose whims reshaped the fate of millions. Let us walk through the shadowed corridors of history and meet them. The story begins with Augustus, the first emperor. Born Octavian, he was the adopted son of Julius Caesar. When Caesar was struck down by daggers in the Senate, Rome was plunged into chaos. Civil war raged, and out of it emerged Octavian, calm, clever, and ruthless. He defeated rivals, crushed rebellion, and remade the Republic into an empire, though he cloaked his power in careful humility. Augustus was no mad tyrant. He was a master of appearances. He called himself princeps, the first citizen, rather than king. He honoured the Senate, kept traditions alive, and promised peace after decades of war. And true to his word, he ushered in the Pax Romana, a golden age of stability that lasted for centuries. But not every emperor was like Augustus. Some, like Caligula, reveal the darker side of power. At first, the people loved him, young, handsome, generous, but illness twisted his mind, and soon Rome whispered of horrors. Caligula declared himself a living god. He built temples to his own divinity. He squandered fortunes on games and spectacles, then turned cruel, ordering executions on a whim. One tale says he made his horse Incitatus a priest, and some claimed he even planned to make it a consul of Rome. Whether truth or legend, the story speaks of how absolute power could unhinge the human mind. Then came Nero, the emperor whose name is forever linked with fire. In his early years, Nero was guided by wise tutors, but as he grew, ambition and paranoia consumed him. He fancied himself a great artist, singing songs and performing on stage while his empire groaned. When the great fire of Rome swept through the city, people whispered that Nero had watched from his palace, playing his lyre as the flames devoured homes. Whether or not the tale is true, Nero used the fire as an excuse to build a massive palace, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, filled with jewels, marble halls, and even a lake. To fund his luxuries, he bled the empire dry. To silence critics, he turned cruelty upon them. Christians, then a small and strange sect, were blamed for the fire, and Nero had them burned alive to light his gardens. In time, his tyranny turned even his guards against him. Alone, abandoned, Nero ended his life with the words, "What an artist dies in me." Not all emperors were madmen. Some were visionaries. Hadrian, for example, was a builder. He travelled across the empire, from Britain to the east, inspecting provinces, raising monuments, and strengthening defences. In the far north, he ordered the construction of Hadrian's Wall, marking the edge of Roman control. In Athens, he raised temples and sought to honour Greek culture. Unlike rulers who sat in Rome's palaces, Hadrian walked among his people, leaving behind not chaos, but stone legacies that endure to this day. And then there was Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher, emperor. Amid wars and plagues, he turned inward, writing words of wisdom that still echo today. His meditations are a window into a mind burdened by responsibility, yet seeking peace in reason and virtue. He did not revel in cruelty. He sought to rule justly, guided not by madness but by philosophy. To hear his words is to glimpse a ruler struggling not to be swallowed by the storm of power. But power is seductive. After Marcus Aurelius came his son Commodus, a man who undid his father's legacy. Commodus fancied himself the reincarnation of Hercules. He strode into the arena, wielding a club, dressed in lion skins, demanding that Rome see him as a god of strength. He fought gladiators, though always under conditions ensuring his victory. The empire that had been built by centuries of discipline now trembled under the whims of a man-child lost in fantasies. Assassins eventually ended his reign, but not before Rome saw how quickly madness could topple greatness. The emperors were not merely rulers, they were mirrors of Rome itself. In Augustus, we see Rome's discipline and order. In Caligula and Nero, we see her excess and cruelty. In Hadrian and Marcus Aurelius, her wisdom and endurance. In Commodus, her weakness and decay. Together, they formed a tapestry of glory and madness, showing that power on such a scale can either uplift or destroy. Imagine being a citizen in those times. One emperor promises peace, another plunges the city into terror. Statues are raised, coins are struck, temples are dedicated, and then, with a stroke of rebellion or a whisper of conspiracy, the emperor is gone, erased from memory, his name chiselled off monuments. Rome gave her rulers godlike power, but also left them always walking on the edge of a knife. And so, as we wander the ruins of the Colosseum, the Forum, the palaces on the Palatine Hill, we hear their echoes. The laughter of Caligula, the music of Nero, the steady voice of Marcus Aurelius, the shouts of Commodus in the arena. Glory, madness, power, all bound together in the story of Rome's emperors. They were the heart of the empire, for better or worse, and in their triumphs and their downfalls, we see the fragile, dangerous allure of absolute rule. For in the end, the emperors were not gods, though some believed themselves to be. They were men, flawed, brilliant, cruel, wise, and it was their choices that steered the empire toward greatness or ruin. Their shadows still fall across history, reminding us that power, unchecked, can build wonders or burn the world. For centuries, Rome had seemed eternal. Her legions marched undefeated, her emperors ruled as gods, her roads stretched across continents, and her aqueducts carried life into her cities. To those who lived beneath her banners, the empire felt unshakable, like the rising sun or the turning of the seasons. Yet all things, no matter how mighty, carry within them the seeds of their own end. The story of Rome's fall is not one of sudden collapse, but of slow decay, of cracks spreading through marble, of whispers growing into storms, of power slipping away like sand through open fingers. Imagine the empire at its height. The Mediterranean is a Roman lake, ringed with provinces that feed the heart of the empire with grain, gold, and soldiers. Rome is crowded with markets and monuments, her citizens entertained by games, her emperors honoured by statues and shrines. To the outside world, Rome is invincible. But within, unseen forces begin to stir. One cause was wealth itself. Conquest had brought riches beyond imagining, but it also brought corruption. Senators and officials, once bound by duty, grew fat with bribes. Soldiers demanded more pay, and generals turned their loyalty from the Senate to themselves. The very strength that had built Rome, ambition, hunger, discipline, began to turn inward, tearing at the empire like wolves fighting over the same prey. Civil war became a recurring shadow. Rival generals marched on Rome with their legions, spilling Roman blood upon Roman soil. Emperors rose and fell with terrifying speed. In one chaotic year, known as the Year of the Four Emperors, rulers were declared and assassinated almost faster than coins could be minted in their honour. The empire survived, but each struggle left her weaker, her unity fraying at the edges. At the same time, Rome faced enemies pressing from beyond her borders. In the east, the Persians challenged her strength. In the north, Germanic tribes, Goths, Vandals, Franks tested her defences. Once Roman legions could sweep them aside with ease. But as the empire stretched thinner as discipline eroded, those enemies grew bolder. No longer were they just raiders stealing cattle, now they were armies breaking across Roman frontiers like storm waves pounding against a weakening wall. So then came the weight of economy and decay. Rome's wealth had flowed from conquest, but when expansion slowed, the engine faltered. Heavy taxes crushed farmers and citizens, driving many into debt or despair. To feed the vast city of Rome, grain had to be shipped from distant provinces like Egypt. If ships were delayed or storms struck, famine threatened. The city that had once been the centre of power became a burden on its own empire. And still Rome built. Massive palaces, endless games in the Colosseum, monuments to emperors whose names were soon forgotten. Bread and circuses, the poet Juvenal called it. Feed the people, entertain them, and they will not ask why their empire rots beneath the marble. But marble cannot hold back the tide forever. In the 3rd century, the empire nearly broke apart. Historians call it the crisis of the 3rd century. For our century. Emperors rose and fell in dizzying succession. Some ruled only weeks before meeting the assassin's blade. Provinces in the west declared themselves independent. The east threatened to drift away. Plague swept through the empire, thinning the legions, emptying the cities. It seemed as if Rome would crumble then and there. Yet she endured. Strong emperors like Diocletian tried to hold the empire together, even dividing it into east and west so it could be managed more effectively. For a time, this worked. The eastern half, with its great city of Constantinople, grew strong, but the west, the heartland of Rome itself, continued to weaken. And then came Constantine, who embraced a new faith rising in the shadows of the empire, Christianity. Empire, Christianity. What began as a persecuted sect now became the official religion of Rome. Temples to Jupiter and Mars were abandoned, replaced by churches to a single god. The spirit of Rome shifted, her old gods silenced, her culture transformed. Some saw this as renewal, others as betrayal, but change, once begun, cannot be stopped. Cannot be stopped. By the 4th century, the enemies at Rome's gates had grown stronger than ever. The Goths crossed the Danube, fleeing from even fiercer tribes behind them. The Huns, horsemen from the steppes who struck like thunder. Rome tried to settle the Goths as allies, but mistreatment led to revolt. In 378 CE, at the Battle of Adrianople, the Goths destroyed a Roman army and killed an emperor in battle. It was a shock the empire never truly recovered from. Over the next decades, the West staggered under the weight of invasions. And Vandals swept into Spain and North Africa, seizing Rome's breadbasket. Funds under Attila thundered across Europe, feared as the scourge of God. Rome herself, the eternal city, was no longer untouchable. In 410 CE, the Goths under Alaric entered her gates. For the first time in 800 years, Rome was sacked. Citizens wept, believing the world itself was ending. How could the eternal city fall? Yet it did, and it would again. By the mid-5th century, Rome was a shadow of her former self. Provinces slipped away. Emperors were little more than puppets of generals or foreign kings. In 455 CE, the Vandals stormed Rome, looting her treasures and carrying them across the sea. The empire staggered on, a hollow shell. And finally, in 476 EE, the last emperor of the West, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a barbarian king. The Senate sent word to the east, to Constantinople, that Rome no longer needed an emperor. The Western Empire was dead. But was Rome truly gone? Not entirely. In the east, the Byzantine Empire carried on the legacy, its emperors calling themselves Romans for another 1,000 years. The roads, the laws, the language, the architecture, these lived on, shaping Europe and the world long after the last legion had marched. Rome did not vanish. It transformed, its spirit woven into the fabric of history itself. And yet, the fall of Rome stands as a reminder. No empire, no matter how mighty, is eternal. Power can dazzle, armies can conquer, monuments can rise to the heavens, but within every empire, the seeds of decline lie waiting. Corruption, division, arrogance, decay. Rome showed the heights humanity can reach and the depths to which it can fall. So as you close your eyes and picture the ruins of the Colosseum, the broken aqueducts stretching across lonely fields, the marble columns toppled in silence, remember, these were once alive with voices, laughter, commands, prayers. The empire that called itself eternal could not escape time. And in its rise and fall, we see the story of all great powers. A story that begins in triumph, rises to glory, and ends, slowly, inevitably, in silence. The Roman Empire may have fallen, its emperors long buried, its legions scattered, its palaces and amphitheatres crumbled into ruins, and yet Rome is not gone. It lingers all around us, in the words we speak, the laws we follow, the roads we travel, and even in the dreams we dream of power, order, and empire. Rome's body may lie in the dust of history, but its spirit still breathes in our world today. Close your eyes and imagine walking through a modern city, New York, Paris, London, or even Islamabad. Look at the government buildings with their marble columns, their domes, their arches. Hear the voices of politicians debating in chambers that echo the Roman Senate. Step into a courthouse and you will find Roman law beneath the surface, the foundation upon which justice was built. Rome is in the very stones and ideas of our age. One of Rome's most enduring gifts is her law. The Romans believed that order must be written down, that rights and duties must be made clear. From the 12 tables of the early Republic to the great Codex of Justinian in the Byzantine era, Roman law shaped how property was owned, how contracts were made, how justice was judged. Even today, in Europe, in America, in much of the modern world, legal systems draw their bloodline from Rome. The idea that no one is above the law, not even a ruler, is a Roman inheritance. Then there is language. Latin, the tongue of Rome, still whispers in our ears. Though few speak it as a native language now, it survives in the Romance languages: Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian. Even English, though Germanic at its roots, carries thousands of Latin words. When doctors speak of the body, when scientists name the stars, when lawyers craft their arguments, the language of Rome lives on. It is as if every time we speak, fragments of empire rise again. Rome also left us architecture. Think of the triumphal arch, the domed roof, the amphitheatre. They are not relics, they are blueprints still in use. The US Capitol building, the Pantheon in Paris, the grand cathedrals of Europe, all borrow from Roman genius. Even the concrete beneath your feet, that grey miracle of modern construction, was perfected by the Romans 2,000 years ago. They built harbours that resisted the sea, aqueducts that still stand, walls that defied time itself. Modern engineers still marvel at their craft. And what of roads? We drive cars now instead of marching in legions, but the principle is the same. Straight, enduring paths that connect city to city, trade to trade, culture to culture. The first great highway systems of the world were Roman, and they showed us that to bind a people together, you must first bind their lands. Even the postal systems and networks of today are echoes of Rome's couriers racing along the Via Appia. The Romans also gave us ideas of government. The Republic, with its Senate, its assemblies, its checks and balances, though imperfect, it inspired later ages. The founding fathers of America studied Rome deeply, seeking to learn from her successes and her failures. The word Senate itself comes from Rome, as does the concept of the citizen soldier, the civic duty to serve, the fear of tyranny. In many ways, modern democracies are haunted by Rome, trying to capture her order, while avoiding her mistakes. Rome's influence extended into religion as well. Out of her empire grew Christianity, once a persecuted faith, later the official religion of emperors. From Rome, missionaries carried the cross to every corner of Europe, and from Europe to the rest of the world. The Catholic Church, centered in Rome, still carries the city's name and its spirit centuries after the legions marched their last. Even beyond religion, Rome gave us rituals of power, the crowning of rulers, the processions of state, the symbols of eagles and laurel wreaths that nations still use. And beyond the tangible, law, language, roads, architecture, Rome left us something more subtle, an idea. The idea of empire, of greatness, of civilization stretching beyond borders. For centuries after Rome's fall, kings and conquerors tried to claim her mantle. Charlemagne dreamed of a holy Roman Empire. Napoleon saw himself as a new Caesar. Even today, the very word empire carries echoes of Rome. She became the standard by which power is measured. But Rome also left us warnings. She showed that wealth without discipline leads to corruption. That armies without loyalty to the state turn into weapons for ambition. That entertainment can distract a people while their foundations crumble. That no empire, no matter how eternal it seems, is beyond the reach of time. To study Rome is not only to admire her, but to learn from her mistakes. For in her fall, we see what might happen to any great power blinded by pride. So when you walk among ruins, The Colosseum in Rome, the aqueducts of Spain, the broken walls of Britain. Remember that these are not merely stones. They are messages. They whisper across centuries, telling us who we are, where we came from, and what we might become. The Romans dreamed of eternity. And in a way they achieved it, not in their empire of land, but in the empire of memory, of culture, of influence. Rome is still with us. In every courthouse, in every cathedral, in every road that stretches straight across the land, in every language shaped by Latin, in every law written with Roman clarity. She may have fallen as an empire, but she rose again in us. And as long as we remember, as long as we walk the paths she laid, Rome endures. So now, as you drift into sleep, think of the empire that was. Hear the march of legions on stone roads, the rush of water through aqueducts, the roar of the Colosseum, the whispers of emperors in marble halls. Marble halls. Rome has fallen, yes, but Rome has also never left. She is all around us, alive in every corner of our world. And perhaps, in remembering her, in learning her lessons, we too can build something that will last, not for centuries, but for eternity. The story of Rome has carried us across centuries, from the march of disciplined legions to the whispers of emperors in gilded palaces, from the roar of the Colosseum to the silence of broken ruins. We have seen glory and madness, triumph and tragedy, creation and collapse. And tragedy, creation and collapse. And though the empire itself has long since fallen, its echo has never faded. Rome teaches us that human ambition can build wonders, aqueducts that still stand, laws that still govern, languages that still breathe. Yet it also warns us that arrogance, greed and corruption can erode even the strongest foundations. Rome's rise and fall is not just ancient history. It is a mirror reflecting truths about power, greatness and fragility that remain as relevant today as they were 2,000 years ago. So as you rest now, imagine the empire one last time, the sun setting over the Tiber, glinting off marble temples. A legion marching steadily into the horizon, their footsteps fading into memory. The hum of markets, the laughter of children in Roman streets, the prayers of citizens to gods who no longer reign, all of it, gone and yet still here, alive in us, in the world they shaped, in the lessons they left. Rome called itself eternal, and in a way it was right. Not in her emperors, not in her armies, but in her enduring spirit, carried forward in every stone, every word, every dream of civilization. And so we close this journey, leaving Rome where it belongs, not just in the past, but in the eternal present. For Rome, in truth, never truly died. Sleep now with the echoes of empire in your mind. The story of Rome is over, but her voice will always whisper through time.